The August sun pressed down on Fort Bragg with the weight of a punishment, and Captain Marcus Brennan loved every degree of it. He stood at the edge of the training yard with his arms crossed, watching recruit Peters stumble through his 40th burpee while the rest of the class held plank position in the dirt. Peters collapsed face first into the ground. His arms had given out completely, trembling like a man twice his age. Brennan walked over slowly, his boots crunching against the packed earth. He stopped with his shadow, falling directly across the recruit's heaving back. "Get up," he said. His voice carried the calm of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Peters pushed himself to his knees, sweat and dust coating his face. "Captain, I need water. I think I'm going to pass out." Brennan looked over his shoulder at his 3 sergeants. Rodriguez, Mills, and Patterson stood in a loose semicircle near the equipment shed, and their laughter rippled across the yard as Patterson pulled out his phone to record. "You think," Brennan said, turning back to Peters. "That is your problem right there, recruit." Thinking. He kicked a spray of dirt across the young man's chest. "In my program, you do not think. You do what I tell you, when I tell you, until I tell you to stop. Now, get up." Peters tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He went down hard on his side. Brennan crouched beside him, close enough that only Peters could hear. "You wash out of my course. I will make sure you spend the next 3 years cleaning latrines at the worst posting I can find. Your file will say you are a quitter. Your career will be over before it starts." He stood and raised his voice for the others. "Somebody drag this waste of oxygen to the shade before he dies on my field, and I have to fill out paperwork." 2 recruits broke from plank position to help Peters. Brennan did not stop them. He had made his point, and the fear in their eyes as they lifted their fallen classmate told him everything he needed to know about how the rest of the day would go. Rodriguez approached with a clipboard. "Captain, the new assessment bus is inbound. Should be here in about 10 minutes. Brennan checked his watch. "Fresh meat." He smiled without warmth. "How many this round?" 14 candidates. Mixed backgrounds, mostly prior service looking to move into support roles. Brennan scanned the list Rodriguez handed him. His eyes stopped on one name. Elena Valle, civilian contractor candidate. No military family listed, no prior service, no connections worth mentioning. The photograph showed a small woman with dark hair and an uncertain expression. "This one," Brennan said, tapping the photo. "No protection, no family in the service to complain. She will be out by Friday." Rodriguez nodded. "Easy target. They always break faster when they are alone," Brennan said. He handed the clipboard back and turned to watch the road. "Now, wherever you're watching this from, maybe you have seen someone like Brennan before. Maybe at a job, maybe in a school, maybe somewhere else entirely. The type who picks their targets carefully, who knows exactly who they can push because no one is watching, no one will believe, no one will care. Keep that feeling in mind as this story unfolds." The bus appeared at the compound gate 11 minutes later, a gray transport vehicle that had seen better decades. It rolled to a stop near the training yard, and the door hissed open. 14 candidates filed out in a ragged line, blinking against the brutal sunlight. Most of them were men in their mid-20s, thick-necked and trying to look confident. A few women scattered among them, standing straighter than necessary. Elena Valle was the last to step off the bus. She was smaller than the photograph suggested, maybe 5'4", with her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her eyes swept across the training yard in a quick survey that lasted less than 2 seconds. She noted the positions of the 3 sergeants. She noted the recruit being helped toward the medical station. She noted the sweat stains on Captain Brennan's uniform that indicated he had been out here for hours, performing for an audience. Then she dropped her gaze to the ground and shuffled into line with the others, her shoulders curved inward, her hands clasped in front of her. Brennan walked the length of the formation, examining each candidate like livestock at auction. He stopped in front of Valle. "You are the civilian," he said. "Yes, Captain." Her voice came out thin, uncertain. Brennan leaned closer. "You know what we do to civilians who think they belong here?" Valle shook her head, not meeting his eyes. "We break them." He straightened and addressed the entire group. "I am Captain Marcus Brennan, and for the next 2 weeks, your life belongs to me. You will eat when I say eat. You will sleep when I say sleep. You will breathe when I say breathe. By the time I am finished with you, half of you will be gone. The other half will wish you were." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I will break every single one of you by the end of this course," Brennan continued. "The only question is whether you break smart and learn something, or break stupid and wash out." He looked directly at Vale. "Some of you, I already know the answer." Vale flinched visibly, drawing a fresh round of laughter from his sergeants. But behind that flinch, behind those downcast eyes, Major Elena Vance was already cataloging her first 3 violations of Military Conduct Code. The hidden phone in her pocket had begun recording the moment she stepped off the bus, and every word Brennan spoke was uploading to a secure JSOC server 300 miles away. She had been watching him for 6 weeks through other eyes, reading incident reports, studying medical records of recruits who had been hospitalized under his command. Now she was here in person, and Captain Marcus Brennan had no idea that the woman he had just marked as his easiest target was the most dangerous person on this base. Rodriguez approached Brennan as the candidates were led toward their barracks. "That Vale woman looked terrified," he said with satisfaction. Brennan watched her retreating form. "Good. Terrified ones make the best examples." 6 weeks earlier, the fluorescent lights of JSOC Command Center hummed with the quiet intensity of secrets being kept. Colonel Patricia Hammond stood at the head of a briefing table in a windowless room 3 floors below ground level, her silver eagles catching the harsh light as she spread 4 manila folders across the polished surface. Major Elena Vance sat across from her, still wearing the dust of her last deployment. She had landed at Pope Field 6 hours ago, after 11 months in a location that did not officially exist, conducting operations that would never appear in any report. 47 confirmed kills in that time. 0 American casualties under her command, the kind of record that made generals request her by name. Hammond tapped the first folder. Specialist David Chun, 22 years old, former high school wrestler, wanted to be Special Forces since he was 14. He washed out of Captain Marcus Brennan's selection course 8 months ago with 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung. Vance opened the folder. The medical photographs showed purple and black bruising across the young man's torso, the kind of damage that came from repeated blows rather than a single accident. "Training accident," Hammond said. "That is what the official report claims. Chun fell during an obstacle course exercise. These contusions are not consistent with a fall," Vance said. "No, they are not." Hammond slid the second folder forward. Private First Class Maria Santos. Fractured orbital socket. Report says she walked into a door during night navigation training. Vance studied the image of a young woman's swollen face, her left eye socket visibly displaced. Who walks into a door with enough force to fracture bone? According to Brennan's paperwork, Santos did. Hammond opened the third folder herself. Specialist Ryan Torres. Ruptured spleen. The report claims he landed wrong during a parachute training exercise, except Torres was never scheduled for jump training that week. He was in Brennan's ground combat course. The fourth folder contained similar horrors. A recruit named Patterson with a dislocated shoulder. A recruit named Williams with second-degree burns that were attributed to a cooking accident in the field kitchen, except Williams had never been assigned to kitchen duty. Vance closed the final folder and met Hammond's eyes. For hospitalizations in 8 months. All under the same commander. Why is Brennan still running this course? Hammond sat down heavily. Because his uncle is Major General Richard Brennan, Deputy Chief of Staff at the Pentagon. Every complaint that has ever been filed against Captain Brennan has been routed through channels that his uncle controls. The complaints disappear. The victims get transferred to distant postings. The pattern continues. Vance felt the familiar cold settling in her chest. The same feeling she got before a mission when the target was confirmed and the only question left was execution. "What do you need from me, Colonel?" Hammond pulled a fifth folder from her briefcase, this one marked with a red classification stripe. Operation Clean Sweep. JSOC has been authorized to conduct an internal investigation into abuse at selection courses across all Special Operations Commands. Brennan's program is the worst offender, but we believe there are others. The problem is evidence. These victims are young soldiers who have been told their careers will end if they speak up. They're scared, isolated, and they have no proof. So you need someone on the inside, Vance said. I need someone who can document what Brennan does without being detected. Someone who can take whatever he dishes out without breaking cover. Someone who, if Brennan decides to make an example of them, can handle themselves without compromising the mission. Hammond paused. I need a Delta operator who can pretend to be a helpless civilian for 6 weeks. Vance picked up the red folder and began reading. Her cover identity was already prepared. Elena Vale, 31 years old, former private security contractor looking to transition into military support roles. No family in the service. No connections. No one who would ask questions if she disappeared. He will target me, Vance said. A woman with no protection, no military background. I will be exactly what he is looking for. That is what we are counting on. Hammond reached into her briefcase again and produced a smartphone that looked identical to a standard military-issue device. This phone has been modified by our technical division. It records continuously when activated and uploads to secure JSOC servers every 6 hours via encrypted satellite link. Brennan can take it from you, examine it, even factory reset it, and he will never find the hidden partition where the footage is stored. Vance turned the phone over in her hands. It felt slightly heavier than a normal device, but only someone who knew what to look for would notice. You will have no backup on site, Hammond said. No extraction team. No support personnel who know your real identity. If Brennan or his men decide to escalate beyond verbal abuse, you will be on your own until we can mobilize a response. Understood. Hammond leaned forward. Elena, I need to be clear about something. If this works, we will take down not just Brennan, but everyone who has been protecting him. His uncle, the officers who looked the other way, the entire network that allowed this to happen. But if you are exposed before we have enough evidence, Brennan's people will bury everything and the victims will never see justice. Vance stood and tucked the phone into her pocket. Then I will not be exposed. That conversation had taken place 43 days ago. Now, in the cramped barracks at Fort Bragg, surrounded by 13 other candidates who had no idea who she really was, Major Elena Vance checked her phone one final time before lights out. The screen showed a simple message from a number that did not exist in any directory. Upload complete. Files received. 847. 847 pieces of evidence. 6 weeks of documentation. Brennan screaming at recruits. Brennan shoving a candidate against a wall. Brennan threatening careers, families, futures. His 3 sergeants laughing, recording, participating. Tomorrow, Brennan would begin his campaign to break her. He would escalate his abuse, convinced that she was helpless, convinced that no one was watching, convinced that his uncle's protection made him untouchable. Vance deleted the message and closed her eyes. She had taken down terrorist cells in 4 countries. She had eliminated high-value targets that entire task forces had failed to reach. She had spent 11 months in the most dangerous places on Earth, and she had come home without a scratch. Captain Marcus Brennan had no idea what he had just invited into his program. The obstacle course stretched across 400 meters of Fort Bragg's most punishing terrain, a gauntlet of walls, rope climbs, mud pits, and barbed wire crawls that had broken better candidates than the 14 who now stood at its starting line. The temperature had climbed past 95 degrees by 0900 hours, and Captain Brennan had ordered all water stations removed. Hydration is a crutch, he announced as he paced before the assembled candidates. The enemy will not give you water breaks. The desert will not give you water breaks. I will not give you water breaks. You drink when I say you drink, and I am not saying it today. Vance stood near the middle of the formation, her posture slightly hunched, her expression carefully vacant. Around her, the other candidates exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a stocky man named Reeves, looked like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Sergeant First Class David Chun watched from the shade of the equipment shed, a clipboard in his hands that he was not really reading. He had transferred to Brennan's command 3 weeks ago, and each day had brought fresh reasons to regret the assignment. The captain's methods went beyond tough training. Chen had seen tough training at Fort Benning, at Ranger School, at a dozen other posts where instructors pushed candidates to their limits. This was something else. This was cruelty dressed up in camouflage. But Chen said nothing. He had been told on his first day that complaints about Captain Brennan went through channels controlled by the captain's uncle at the Pentagon. He had been told that the last sergeant who raised concerns had been transferred to a weather station in Alaska within 72 hours. He had been told to keep his head down and his mouth shut. So he watched. Brennan blew his whistle, and the candidates surged forward. The first obstacle was a 12-foot wall with no handholds, designed to require teamwork to overcome. Vance hung back deliberately, letting others boost her over, making herself look weaker than she was. In reality, she could have cleared that wall in a single fluid motion. She had scaled compound walls in Yemen with 50 pounds of gear on her back, while enemy fire chipped concrete inches from her head. But Elena Vale, civilian contractor candidate, struggled. She scrambled. She accepted help with grateful, nervous eyes. The course wound through the training grounds like a serpent designed by sadists. Rope climbs that shredded palms. Low crawls through mud that smelled of stagnant water and old sweat. Balance beams set over pits that would mean a twisted ankle for anyone who fell. Halfway through, a candidate named Martinez stumbled. She was a young woman, maybe 23, with the lean build of a distance runner. The heat had gotten to her. Her face had gone pale beneath the flush of exertion, and her steps had become unsteady over the past 100 meters. When she reached the cargo net climb, her hands could not find their grip. She slid back down and crumpled to her knees. Brennan was there in seconds. He grabbed Martinez by her upper arm and hauled her to her feet. His fingers dug into her bicep with force that would leave bruises shaped like fingerprints. He pulled her face close to his, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "What is this, Martinez? You think you could just stop? You think you could just quit in the middle of my course?" "Captain, I need water. I think I'm having heat stroke. You're having a failure of character." Brennan's voice rose to a volume that carried across the entire training ground. Every candidate within 200 meters stopped to watch. "You are weak, Martinez. You are pathetic. I have seen children with more fight than you. Do you want me to call your parents and tell them their daughter is a quitter? Do you want to end your career right here, right now?" Martinez was crying. The tears cut tracks through the dust on her cheeks, and her body shook with the effort of staying upright. Chen took a step forward from the equipment shed. His hand tightened on the clipboard until his knuckles went white. He should do something. He should say something. He should walk over there and remind Brennan that heat stroke was a medical emergency, that what he was doing could kill this woman. But Rodriguez caught his eye from across the yard. The senior sergeant shook his head once, a small motion that carried an unmistakable warning. Chen stopped. Vance had positioned herself 30 meters away, close enough for her phone to capture clear audio. She watched Martinez sob while Brennan continued his tirade, watched the young woman's arm go red where his grip had not released, watched the other candidates freeze in terrified silence. She could end this right now. One phone call to Hammond and the extraction team would be here within the hour. Brennan would be in custody by sunset. But one incident was not enough. They needed the pattern. They needed the documentation that proved this was not a single loss of temper, but a systematic campaign of abuse. They needed enough evidence to take down not just Brennan, but everyone who had protected him. So Vance did nothing. She watched, and she recorded, and she waited. Brennan finally released Martinez with a shove that sent her stumbling backward. "Drink station is 400 meters that way," he said, pointing toward the finish line. "If you cannot make it on your own 2 feet, you're out of my program." Martinez made it. Barely. She staggered across the finish line 11 minutes later and collapsed beside the water cooler, drinking so fast she nearly choked. That night, in the barracks after lights out, Vance reviewed her footage on the phone's hidden partition. The video was clear. Brennan's grip on Martinez's arm, the bruising already visible even through the dusty resolution. His voice, captured in perfect fidelity, threatening her career and her future. She was adding the file to the evidence package when footsteps approached her bunk. Chin stood in the shadows between the rows of beds, his face unreadable in the dim light. "Vale," he said quietly. "Are you okay?" Vance adopted her cover persona instantly, shrinking slightly, letting uncertainty creep into her voice. "I am fine, Sergeant. Just tired." Chin glanced toward the barracks door, checking that no one else was listening. "It was not always like this. When I got here 3 weeks ago, I thought this was supposed to be tough but fair. This is something else." Vance filed the information away. A potential ally. A potential witness who had seen the pattern from inside Brennan's command structure. "I just keep my head down," she said. "Try not to get noticed." Chin nodded, something like regret in his eyes. "That is probably smart." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Just be careful around the captain. He likes to make examples of people, and I think he has already picked you." He disappeared into the darkness before Vance could respond. She lay back on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Chin was right. Brennan had marked her as his next target. Every instinct from her years in Delta Force told her exactly how this would escalate, exactly what kind of man Brennan was, exactly how far he would go when he believed no one was watching. The phone in her pocket held 853 files now. Martinez's assault was number 854. She closed her eyes and began planning for tomorrow. Captain Marcus Brennan sat in his office at 0600 hours, a cup of black coffee steaming beside a stack of personnel folders. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across his desk as he flipped through the files of his current candidates, making notes in red ink beside each name. Reeves, prior infantry. Father was a sergeant major. 2 connected to break publicly, marked for standard treatment. Hernandez, former Marine. Brother serves on Senator Mitchell's security detail. Handle with caution. He worked through the stack methodically, sorting each candidate into categories based on a calculus he had perfected over 4 years of running this course. Some had protection, families in the service who would ask questions if their son or daughter came home broken. Others had connections to politicians or high-ranking officers who might take an interest if complaints surfaced. And then there were the others, the ones with no protection at all. Brennan pulled Elena Vale's folder from the bottom of the stack and spread it open. Civilian contractor candidate. No military service. No family in the armed forces. Parents deceased. No siblings. Emergency contact listed as a former employer at a private security firm that had gone out of business 2 years ago. She was perfect. Brennan smiled and circled her name 3 times in red ink. He wrote 2 words in the margin, primary target. The classroom session began at 0800 in a cinder block building that had been constructed during the Cold War and never updated since. 40 metal chairs faced a chalkboard, and the air conditioning had been broken for a decade. Sweat began forming on the candidates within minutes of taking their seats. Brennan stood at the front of the room with a pointer in his hand, lecturing on small unit tactics with the enthusiasm of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice. Rodriguez, Mills, and Patterson lined the back wall, their presence a reminder that everything said in this room would be remembered and potentially used. "Now," Brennan said, stopping mid-sentence to scan the rows of candidates. His eyes settled on the small woman sitting in the 3rd row, her notebook open but mostly empty. "Vale, explain to the class the principles of fire and maneuver in an urban environment." Vance looked up with carefully manufactured panic. She let her pen slip from her fingers, let her mouth open and close twice before any sound came out. "Sir, I am not sure I understand the question." "It is not a complicated question, Vale. Fire and maneuver. Urban environment. Or did they not teach basic tactics at whatever strip mall security company you worked for before you decided to waste my time?" Laughter rippled from the back of the room. Rodriguez slapped his thigh. Mills covered his mouth. Patterson did not bother hiding his amusement. Vance stammered through an answer that was deliberately wrong, mixing up suppressive fire with covering fire, confusing enfilade positions with defilade, mangling terminology that she could recite in her sleep. She had written the updated manual on urban combat tactics 2 years ago, a classified document that was now standard reading at every special operations school in the country. But Elena Vale, civilian contractor, did not know that. That, Brennan announced to the class, is exactly what happens when we let civilians think they belong in our world. He walked slowly toward Vance's desk, each footstep echoing in the silent room. You do not know what you do not know, Vale. And what you do not know will get soldiers killed. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers. The coffee and menthol on his breath filled her nostrils. Maybe you should just quit now, he said softly. Save us both the trouble. Vance lowered her eyes to her desk. Yes, Captain. I understand, Captain. Brennan straightened and returned to the front of the room, satisfaction evident in every line of his posture. The rest of the lecture passed without incident, but every few minutes his gaze would drift back to Vance, watching her squirm, enjoying the fear he believed he had created. The afternoon brought a 5-mile ruck march through terrain that alternated between dense forest and open clearings. Standard load was 45 pounds. Brennan stopped Vance at the starting line. Vale, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Since you clearly need extra motivation to improve, you'll be carrying supplemental weight today. He gestured to Patterson, who produced a canvas sack filled with sand. Another 20 pounds. Consider it an incentive to study harder. The other candidates looked away. No one protested. No one dared. Vance accepted the additional weight without complaint, adjusting her pack straps with the fumbling uncertainty her cover required. Inside, she noted the weight distribution and calculated the adjustment to her stride. 20 pounds was nothing. She had carried wounded teammates twice that weight across mountain passes in Afghanistan while evading enemy patrols. The march began. Vance deliberately fell to the back of the formation, breathing harder than necessary, stumbling occasionally on roots and rocks that a real civilian might find challenging. Brennan watched her struggle with undisguised pleasure, occasionally dropping back to offer encouragement in the form of insults. Move it, Vale. My grandmother could outpace you, and she has been dead for 15 years. Vance gasped an apology and pushed forward. 3 hours later, when the march finally ended, she collapsed near the water station with theatrical exhaustion while the other candidates gave her a wide berth. Nobody wanted to be associated with Brennan's target. Nobody wanted to be next. Rodriguez approached Brennan as the candidates dispersed toward the barracks. She's close to breaking, Rodriguez observed. Another day or two, she will wash out on her own. Brennan shook his head. That is not good enough. I want her gone by Friday, and I want everyone to see it happen. He lowered his voice, though not low enough. Vale breaks by Friday, or I break her myself. We will do it during hand-to-hand training. Public humiliation. Make sure the others understand what happens to people who do not belong here. Rodriguez nodded. I will make sure Mills and Patterson are in position. They walked away together, never noticing the small woman by the water station whose phone had captured every word. That night, Vance reviewed the audio file 3 times. Brennan's voice was clear, his intent unmistakable. Premeditated targeting. Planned assault. Conspiracy among his sergeants to facilitate the abuse. She encrypted the file and queued it for the next satellite upload. 871 pieces of evidence now. Friday was 3 days away. Brennan thought he was hunting her. He had no idea that he had been walking into her trap from the moment she stepped off that bus. 300 miles from Fort Bragg, in a basement room that appeared on no official floor plan, Colonel Patricia Hammond spread 47 incident reports across her conference table. Each report had been generated from footage uploaded by Major Vance over the past 6 weeks, time-stamped and cataloged by a team of analysts who had been working in rotating shifts since the operation began. Captain Jennifer Williams, the JAG officer assigned to Operation Clean Sweep, stood beside her with a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. Her face had grown progressively grimmer as she reviewed each file. This one, Williams said, tapping a photograph of a young man's bruised torso. Specialist Torres, 3 months ago. The video clearly shows Brennan kicking him repeatedly while he was on the ground. Torres was hospitalized for 6 days with internal bleeding. The official report says he fell during an exercise. Hammond nodded. What are we looking at in terms of charges? Williams flipped through her notes. Based on what Major Vance has documented, We have grounds for multiple counts of assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, creation of a hostile environment, and potentially conspiracy given the involvement of his 3 sergeants. She paused. Colonel, some of these incidents could qualify as aggravated assault. We're talking about serious prison time if this goes to court-martial. If, Hammond repeated. Williams met her eyes. The evidence is overwhelming, ma'am. 47 separate incidents on video. Clear audio of threats and premeditated targeting. But Brennan's uncle controls the complaint channels. If we move too soon, before we have an airtight case, General Brennan will find a way to bury this like he has buried everything else. Hammond walked to her desk and picked up a secure phone. She dialed a number from memory and waited. A voice answered on the 3rd ring. Medical Records Archive, Fort Bragg. Sergeant Cooper speaking. Sergeant Cooper, this is Colonel Hammond, JSOC. I am transmitting an authorization code now. I need you to pull all medical intake records for candidates in Captain Marcus Brennan's selection course over the past 18 months. There was a pause, then the sound of keyboard clicks. Yes, ma'am. Authorization confirmed. How soon do you need these records? Within the hour. The records arrived 53 minutes later via encrypted transfer. Hammond and Williams spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing injury reports with dates, names, and Brennan's duty schedule. The pattern was undeniable. 11 candidates had been hospitalized during Brennan's tenure. Every single one had been treated for injuries inconsistent with their official explanations. Broken ribs attributed to falls. Facial fractures blamed on equipment malfunctions. Internal bleeding listed as overexertion. And in every case, the candidate had been transferred to a distant posting within weeks of their discharge from the medical facility. They scattered them, Williams said quietly. Anyone who might talk, anyone who might compare stories, they sent to opposite ends of the globe. Hammond pulled up a map on her computer screen. Fort Wainwright, Alaska, Okinawa, Stuttgart, Fort Irwin. These 6 candidates are spread across 4 continents. Someone made very sure they would never be in the same room together. Can we reach them? Williams nodded slowly. With JSOC authorization, we can contact their current commanders and request voluntary statements. If they're willing to testify about what really happened to them, we can add their cases to the evidence package. Do it. Hammond stood and walked to the window, though there was nothing to see but concrete walls. Contact CID and have a tactical team placed on standby at Pope Field. Brief the military police unit at Bragg, but keep it contained. When Major Vance triggers this operation, we need to be ready to move within minutes. Williams made a note. What about the Pentagon? General Brennan will hear about this the moment we make an arrest. Hammond turned to face her. General Brennan is about to learn that his nephew's protection has an expiration date. The Secretary of Defense has been briefed. When we move with full authority from the top of the chain of command. Back at Fort Bragg, Major Elena Vance sat in the mess hall with a tray of food she had barely touched. The room hummed with the low conversation of candidates too tired to speak loudly, too nervous to be silent. She watched Sergeant Chun enter through the side door and collect his meal. Instead of joining Rodriguez, Mills, and Patterson at their usual table, he walked past them without acknowledgement and sat alone in the far corner of the room. Rodriguez said something to Mills, and both men laughed while looking in Chen's direction. Patterson shook his head with obvious disgust. Vance filed the observation away. Chen was isolating himself, whether from guilt, fear, or moral objection. The newest member of Brennan's team was separating from the pack. In her experience, isolated members were the first to break when pressure was applied. Chen might prove useful when the operation went live. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. A single character message from a block number. The letter K. Confirmation. JSOC had received her latest upload. The evidence package was growing by the hour. Vance calculated the timeline. Brennan had promised to break her by Friday, which was now 2 days away. The hand-to-hand training session was scheduled for 0900 on that day. His 3 sergeants would be positioned around the training yard. He would call her forward as a demonstration partner, and then he would assault her in front of the entire class, believing she was helpless, believing no one who mattered was watching. He was half right. She was far from helpless. But someone was very much watching, and they were ready. She finished her water and carried her tray to the disposal station, her movements slow and tired, her shoulders rounded with the exhaustion her cover required. 2 more days. 874 pieces of evidence. One triggering incident away from bringing down Captain Marcus Brennan and everyone who had ever protected him. Vance returned to her barracks and began preparing for what Friday would bring. The phone on Captain Brennan's desk rang at 05:45 before the sun had cleared the tree line beyond the training grounds. He recognized the number immediately and straightened in his chair before answering. Marcus, his uncle's voice, came through with an edge that Brennan had rarely heard. "We need to talk." General Brennan was not a man who wasted words. He had risen through the ranks on a combination of tactical brilliance and political ruthlessness, and he had spent the past 4 years making sure his nephew's indiscretions remained invisible to the chain of command. "I am hearing rumors," the general said. "Someone at JSOC has been asking questions about selection course protocols across Special Operations Commands." Your name came up. Brennan leaned back in his chair. "My name comes up because I run the most effective program in the force. My washout rate is the highest because I maintain the highest standards. If JSOC has a problem with that, they can take it up with the training directorate. This is not about washout rates." There was a pause on the line. "Someone has been pulling medical records, Marcus. Hospitalization reports from the past 18 months, cross-referencing them with duty schedules." For the first time, something cold flickered through Brennan's chest. He suppressed it immediately. "Let them look. Every injury in my program has been documented according to regulations. Training accidents happen. They had better be training accidents," his uncle said, "because if someone finds evidence of anything else, I may not be able to protect you. Not from JSOC, and certainly not from the Secretary's office." The call ended without pleasantries. Brennan sat in the silence for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he pushed the conversation from his mind. His uncle was being paranoid. The medical records showed exactly what they were supposed to show because Brennan had made sure of it. Every incident had been documented as an accident. Every witness had been transferred before they could compare stories. Every complaint had been routed through channels his uncle controlled. He was untouchable. He had always been untouchable. And today, he would prove it. The hand-to-hand training session began at 0900 in the outdoor combat pit, a 30-meter circle of packed sand surrounded by wooden bleachers. The candidates sat in rows, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and apprehension. Brennan stood in the center of the pit with his sleeves rolled up and his boots planted wide. "Today," he announced, "we begin practical application of close-quarters combat techniques. The purpose of this training is to prepare you for situations where weapons are not available and survival depends on your ability to neutralize a threat with your bare hands." He scanned the rows until he found his target. "Thompson, get down here." Recruit Thompson was a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s, former infantry with a deployment to Iraq on his record. He climbed down from the bleachers with the wariness of someone who had heard stories about what happened in this pit. Brennan circled him slowly. "Thompson, you have combat experience. You think you know how to fight?" "Yes, Captain." "Show me." Thompson raised his hands in a defensive posture, weight balanced, eyes tracking Brennan's movement. He had clearly trained somewhere, probably at a boxing gym or MMA facility during his off-duty hours. Brennan moved without warning. He feinted left, then drove his right elbow into Thompson's face with force that sent a spray of blood across the sand. Thompson staggered, his hands going to his nose, which had already begun to swell. "In real combat," Brennan said calmly, turning to address the bleachers while Thompson bled behind him, "your enemy will not wait for you to be ready. He will not follow rules. He will not care if you're tired or scared or unprepared." He walked past the injured recruit without a second glance and stopped in front of the candidates, his eyes finding Elena Vale in the third row. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will practice advanced techniques. I will need a volunteer from the class to assist with the demonstration." His lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. someone who could use the extra training. Vance let her face show the fear her cover required, shrinking slightly under his gaze. Brennan held her eyes for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the pit. Behind him, two candidates helped Thompson to his feet while blood dripped from his chin onto the sand. That evening, Sergeant Chen found Patterson in the sergeant's quarters, cleaning his sidearm with methodical precision. Chen stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "What happened today with Thompson?" Chen said. "That was excessive. He could have broken his nose." Patterson did not look up from his weapon. "Thompson is fine. The captain knows what he is doing." "Does he?" Chen took a step into the room. "I have been here 3 weeks, and I have seen 4 candidates injured badly enough to need medical attention. That is not training. That is assault." Patterson's hands stopped moving. He set down the cleaning cloth and finally met Chen's eyes. "Let me explain something to you, Sergeant. Captain Brennan's uncle is a 2-star general at the Pentagon. Any complaint you file goes through channels that General Brennan controls. The last sergeant who raised concerns is currently counting snowflakes in Alaska. So unless you want to spend the next 3 years at a weather station above the Arctic Circle, I suggest you keep your observations to yourself." Chen said nothing. He turned and walked out into the evening air. He found Vale sitting alone behind the barracks, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. She startled when he approached, which confirmed what he already suspected about how frightened she was. "Vale," he said quietly, sitting down beside her, "you should report sick tomorrow. Tell the medic you have stomach cramps, food poisoning, anything. Just do not go to that training session." Vance kept her voice small and uncertain. "Why? What is going to happen?" Chen looked away. "I do not know exactly, but the captain has been talking about making an example, and I think he has chosen you. Whatever he has planned for tomorrow, it will not be a normal demonstration." Vance was silent for a moment. "If I report sick, will that stop him?" Chen shook his head slowly. "Probably not. He will just wait until you are better. But at least it will buy you time. Maybe you can figure something out." She turned to look at him, and for a moment her eyes held something he could not quite read. "Thank you for the warning, Sergeant, but I will be at training tomorrow." Chen stared at her. "Why?" "Because running never solved anything," Vance said. "And because some people need to be stopped." She stood and walked back toward the barracks, leaving Chen alone with the growing certainty that tomorrow would bring something terrible, and that there was nothing he could do to prevent it. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of gunmetal and air thick enough to taste. The candidates assembled in the combat pit at 0900, filling the bleachers in nervous silence. Word had spread through the barracks overnight about what had happened to Thompson, and every face in the crowd carried the same unspoken question: who would be next? Vance sat in the 3rd row, her posture curved inward, her hands folded in her lap. She had slept 4 hours the night before, which was more than enough. In Yemen, she had once gone 72 hours without sleep while tracking a high-value target through mountain passes. 4 hours was practically luxurious. Her phone was in her front pocket, recording. The satellite upload had occurred at 0400, which meant Colonel Hammond had received every piece of evidence collected through last night. The operation was ready. All it needed was the trigger. Captain Brennan entered the pit at 0900 on the dot, his boots kicking up small clouds of sand with each step. Rodriguez, Mills, and Patterson followed and took positions around the perimeter, their arms crossed, their faces blank. They were blocking the exits, Vance noted. Standard intimidation formation. Brennan stopped in the center of the pit and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Yesterday, he said, finally, we discussed the principles of close-quarters combat. Today, we moved to practical application. He turned slowly, scanning the bleachers until his eyes locked onto Vance. "Vali, get down here." Vance rose from her seat with visible reluctance, her movements slow and uncertain. She climbed down from the bleachers and walked to the center of the pit, stopping 5 meters from Brennan. Her shoulders were hunched. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Every detail was calculated. Every gesture was performance. Brennan circled her like a predator assessing wounded prey. "Look at this," he announced to the assembled candidates. "This is what happens when we lower our standards. This is what happens when we let civilians think they can play soldier." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could count the pores on his face. "Vale, tell me something. What made you think you belonged here? What made you think a woman with no training, no experience, no military blood could survive in my program?" Vance kept her eyes on the ground. "I wanted to serve, Captain. I wanted to contribute." Brennan laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the wooden bleachers. "You wanted to serve." He turned to his sergeants. "She wanted to serve." Rodriguez and Mills laughed on cue. Patterson remained silent, his jaw tight. Brennan leaned close to Vance's ear, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. "I'm going to enjoy this." Then he stepped back and raised his voice for the crowd. "Real combat does not wait for you to be ready," he announced. "Real combat does not care if you're scared or tired or outmatched. Real combat comes for you when you least expect it." He struck her across the face without warning. The blow was open-handed but carried the full force of his body weight behind it. It connected with her left cheek and snapped her head to the side, leaving an immediate red mark that would darken to purple within the hour. The candidates in the bleachers gasped. Someone made a sound of protest that died in their throat. Brennan drew back his hand for a second strike. He never completed the motion. Vance moved in a blur of controlled violence that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Her left hand caught his incoming wrist and redirected the force of his swing past her shoulder. Her right foot swept behind his ankle while her hip drove forward into his center of gravity. Brennan's legs went out from under him, and he hit the sand face first with a sound like a side of beef dropped from height. Before he could process what had happened, Vance had his right arm locked behind his back at an angle that threatened to dislocate his shoulder. Her knee pressed into his spine, pinning him to the ground with pressure that made breathing difficult. Her free hand pressed his face into the sand. The entire sequence had taken less time than a single heartbeat. Silence crashed across the training yard like a physical weight. Rodriguez reached for his sidearm. "I would not do that, Sergeant." Vance's voice had changed completely. Gone was the thin uncertainty of Elena Vale, civilian contractor candidate. In its place was the cold authority of someone who had commanded special operations teams in 4 combat zones. She raised her head and spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the pit. "I am Major Elena Vance, United States Army Delta Force. Captain Marcus Brennan, you are under investigation for assault, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. This facility is now under JSOC jurisdiction." Brennan thrashed beneath her, trying to break free. She increased the pressure on his shoulder by 2 degrees, and he screamed. Rodriguez's hand was still on his weapon. Mills had gone pale. Patterson had not moved at all, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Vance said calmly, "remove your hand from your sidearm and place both hands on your head. You're also under investigation for conspiracy to commit assault. The same applies to Sergeant Mills." Rodriguez did not move. His fingers tightened on the grip of his pistol. In approximately 90 seconds, Vance said, "A CID tactical team will enter this compound through the main gate. They have been on standby at Pope Field since yesterday afternoon. If your weapon is drawn when they arrive, they will respond with appropriate force. The choice is yours." The seconds stretched like hours. Then Rodriguez slowly removed his hand from his sidearm and placed both hands on his head. Mills followed immediately. Patterson raised his hands without being told, relief evident in his exhale. In the bleachers, the candidates sat frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The woman they had watched stumble through obstacle courses, the woman who had stammered through classroom questions, the woman who had seemed like the weakest person on the base had just taken down Captain Marcus Brennan in 3 seconds flat. Chun stood at the edge of the pit, his hands already raised, his eyes fixed on Major Vance with something that looked like wonder. Brennan's voice came out muffled against the sand. "My uncle will destroy you. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Vance leaned down until her mouth was beside his ear. "Your uncle," she said quietly, has already been informed that the Secretary of Defense is personally overseeing this investigation. His protection ended the moment I stepped off that bus 6 weeks ago. She looked up at the sound of vehicles approaching the compound. 4 black SUVs were visible through the main gate, moving fast. The cavalry had arrived. The 4 black SUVs came through the main gate at speed, tires throwing gravel as they crossed the compound toward the training pit. They stopped in a precise formation that blocked every exit route, and 12 CID agents emerged in tactical gear with weapons drawn. Major Vance's phone buzzed once in her pocket. She did not need to look at it. Colonel Hammond's voice came through the speaker clearly, broadcast for everyone in the pit to hear. All units execute. Site is secured. Detain all persons of interest. The CID team moved with the coordination of professionals who had rehearsed this scenario. 4 agents approached the pit and descended into the sand, their weapons trained on Rodriguez and Mills. 2 more took position near Patterson, who had not lowered his raised hands. Captain Marcus Brennan, the lead agent, announced as he reached Vance's position. You are being detained pending investigation into multiple violations of a uniform code of military justice. Do not resist. Vance released the arm lock and stepped back, allowing the agents to take custody. Brennan was hauled to his feet with sand coating his face and uniform. His eyes were wild with fury and disbelief as flex cuffs were secured around his wrists. This is a mistake, he shouted as they led him toward the waiting vehicles. Do you have any idea who my uncle is? I will have your careers. I will have every single one of you court-martialed for this. The agents did not respond. They had heard variations of this speech before, from men who believed their connections made them untouchable. Those men had all learned the same lesson Brennan was about to learn. Rodriguez and Mills were secured next, their weapons confiscated, their protests ignored. Mills tried to argue that he was just following orders, that he had never personally struck any candidate, that this was all a misunderstanding. The flex cuffs went on anyway. Patterson walked forward before the agents reached him. He extended his wrists voluntarily and spoke in a calm voice. I will cooperate fully with the investigation. I have information about incidents dating back 18 months. The lead agent nodded and secured him with notably less force than the others. Sergeant Chin stood at the edge of the pit with his hands still raised, uncertain of his status. An agent approached him and asked for identification. Sergeant First Class David Chun, he said. I transferred to this command 3 weeks ago. I witnessed several incidents, but I was told complaints would be buried. The agent lowered his weapon. You are not currently a person of interest, Sergeant, but we will need a full statement. Please remain on site. Chun nodded, his shoulders dropping with visible relief. In the bleachers, the candidates sat in stunned silence. They had watched their tormentor taken down in seconds by a woman they had pitied. They had seen the man who had terrorized them led away in restraints while he screamed about connections that no longer mattered. The world had inverted in the span of 3 minutes, and none of them knew quite how to process it. Vance climbed out of the pit and walked toward the lead agent. Major Elena Vance, she said. Operation Clean Sweep. Colonel Hammond should be inbound. The agent checked his tactical computer. Affirmative, Major. Colonel Hammond departed JSOC command by helicopter 11 minutes ago. ETA approximately 3 minutes. Vance nodded and turned to survey the compound. The 4 detainees were being loaded into separate vehicles for transport to the MP station. Additional agents were securing Brennan's office and quarters, where documentation of his activities would be collected. A perimeter had been established around the training grounds. 6 weeks of preparation. 874 pieces of evidence. 1 strike across the face that would serve as the triggering incident for the largest investigation into training abuse in special operations history. The sound of rotor blades announced Hammond's arrival before the helicopter appeared over the tree line. It touched down on the parade ground in a controlled descent, and Colonel Hammond emerged before the rotors had stopped spinning. She crossed the compound at a pace that made her jog to keep up, her silver eagles catching the morning light. When she reached Vance, she stopped and took in the scene with a single comprehensive glance. Status report, she said. Vance stood at attention. 4 detainees in custody. Captain Brennan, Sergeants Rodriguez, Mills, and Patterson. Sergeant Chun has indicated willingness to cooperate as a witness. All candidates accounted for. No casualties. Hammond's eyes moved to Vance's face, where the mark from Brennan's strike had begun to darken. Medical team is standing by. I want that documented thoroughly. Yes, ma'am. Hammond looked toward the vehicles where Brennan was still shouting through the closed window. His uncle called the Pentagon an hour ago, trying to get ahead of this. She allowed herself a small, cold smile. The Secretary of Defense took the call personally. General Brennan's request for intervention was denied. He submitted his retirement papers 20 minutes later. Vance processed this information. It is over then. The arrest is over, Hammond corrected. The investigation is just beginning. We have 47 documented incidents, 11 hospitalized victims, and 6 witnesses scattered across 4 continents who are now willing to testify. Captain Williams at JAG is preparing charges that will keep Brennan in Leavenworth for the next 2 decades. A medical team approached with a camera and documentation kit. One of the technicians gestured toward Vance's face. Major, we need to photograph your injuries for the evidence file. Vance turned to allow them to work, holding still while they captured images of the bruising from multiple angles. The strike had been hard enough to leave a mark that would last for days, exactly as Brennan had intended. He had wanted to leave visible evidence of his power over her. Instead, he had left visible evidence of his crime. Hammond watched the documentation process with grim satisfaction. When it was complete, she dismissed the medical team and turned back to Vance. You maintained cover for 6 weeks under conditions that would have broken most operators. You endured harassment, physical strain, and psychological pressure without compromising the mission. She paused. When this is over, there will be a commendation. But right now, I need you to debrief with the CID team and walk them through every piece of evidence we have collected. Vance nodded. Understood, Colonel. She turned toward the administrative building where the CAD team was establishing their command post. Behind her, the candidates were being escorted from the bleachers for individual interviews. Each of them would be asked what they had witnessed during their time in Brennan's program. Each of them would add another piece to the mosaic of abuse that had finally been exposed. The sun had burned through the morning clouds, and for the first time in 6 weeks, Major Elena Vance allowed herself to feel something other than mission focus. It felt like justice beginning. The military police detention facility at Fort Bragg had been built in the 1970s, and it showed its age in every cracked tile and flickering fluorescent tube. Captain Marcus Brennan sat in an interrogation room with his wrists cuffed to a steel table, his uniform still covered in sand from the training pit, and his mind racing through every connection he had ever cultivated. This was a mistake, a massive, career-ending mistake for everyone involved. His uncle would make calls. His uncle would fix this. His uncle had always fixed everything. The door opened, and an MP sergeant entered with the phone. You get 1 call, Captain. Make it count. Brennan recited the number from memory, a direct line that bypassed 3 layers of Pentagon bureaucracy. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Uncle Richard, Brennan said, keeping his voice steady despite the fury churning in his chest. I need you to make some calls. JSOC has overstepped their authority. They arrested me in front of my entire training class based on fabricated evidence from some woman who claims to be Delta Force. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Major General Richard Brennan spoke, his voice carried none of the reassurance his nephew expected. Marcus, I know what happened. I have known for approximately 2 hours. Then you know this is a setup. That woman infiltrated my program under false pretenses. Whatever evidence she claims to have is manufactured. Another pause. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Marcus, his uncle said slowly, I called the Secretary of Defense this morning. I explained the situation. I requested that JSOC be ordered to stand down and release you pending a proper review through normal channels. Brennan felt a spark of hope. And the Secretary informed me that he has been briefed on Operation Clean Sweep for the past 6 weeks. He has personally reviewed the evidence collected by Major Vance. He told me that if I attempted to interfere with this investigation in any way, I would be facing charges of my own. The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. What are you saying? I am saying that I submitted my retirement papers 30 minutes ago. His uncle's voice had gone flat, emotionless. I am saying that the protection you have enjoyed for the past 4 years no longer exists. I am saying that you should cooperate fully with this investigation and pray for leniency, because there is nothing I can do for you. The line went dead. Brennan stared at the phone in his hand. The MP sergeant was watching him with an expression that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. It was hard to tell. Your call is over, Captain, the sergeant said. He retrieved the phone and left Brennan alone with the silence. 3 floors above the detention facility, in a conference room that had been commandeered as Operation Clean Sweep's forward command post, Colonel Hammond spread the evidence package across a long table. Captain Williams from JAG sat across from her, flanked by 2 CID investigators who had been taking notes for the past hour. 847 files, Hammond said. Video evidence of 47 separate incidents of abuse, harassment, and assault. Audio recordings of threats, premeditated targeting, and conspiracy among Captain Brennan and his 3 sergeants. She slid a folder toward Williams, plus the medical records. 11 hospitalizations over 18 months, all with injuries inconsistent with their official explanations. Williams opened the folder and studied the documents. The medical examiner has reviewed these. His preliminary assessment is that at least 7 of these injuries were caused by direct physical assault, not training accidents. One of the CID investigators spoke up. We have also made contact with 6 former candidates who were transferred after their hospitalizations. All 6 have agreed to provide sworn statements. Their accounts are consistent with the pattern documented by Major Vance. Hammond nodded. What charges are we looking at? Williams pulled out her legal pad. Multiple counts of assault. Multiple counts of assault causing bodily harm. Conduct unbecoming an officer. Abuse of authority. Creation of a hostile command environment. And conspiracy for all 4 of them, given the documented coordination between Brennan and his sergeants. Prison time? If convicted on all counts, Captain Brennan is looking at 15 to 25 years at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. Williams set down her pen. The sergeants will likely receive lesser sentences if they cooperate, but none of them are walking away from this. Hammond turned to the senior CD investigator. I want the base commander briefed within the hour. Full disclosure of the investigation, the evidence, and the charges being prepared. This cannot be contained, and we are not going to try. The investigator nodded and left the room to make arrangements. By late afternoon, the news had spread through Fort Bragg like wildfire carried on dry wind. The captain who ran the selection course had been arrested. The sergeants who had enabled him were in custody. A female Delta Force operator had gone undercover for 6 weeks and taken him down in front of his entire class. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions had Vance defeating all 4 men simultaneously. Others claimed she had identified herself while Brennan was still conscious, letting him see exactly who had destroyed him before she put him on the ground. The truth was dramatic enough, but soldiers had never let truth interfere with a good story. In the barracks that had housed the selection course candidates, conversations happened in hushed tones. Martinez sat on her bunk, looking at the bruises on her arm that were finally beginning to fade. She had been grabbed, screamed at, humiliated in front of everyone. She had believed there was nothing she could do. Now the man who had done it to her was in a cell, and the woman who had stopped him was a legend. Recruit Thompson, his nose still swollen from the blow he had taken 2 days earlier, found himself answering questions from a CID investigator who wrote down every word. He described the strike that had come without warning. He described the blood. He described the way Brennan had walked away without a second glance, as though injuring a subordinate was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The investigator thanked him and moved on to the next candidate. By evening, 17 sworn statements had been collected from current candidates alone. Combined with the 6 former victims who had agreed to testify and the evidence Major Vance had gathered over 6 weeks, the case against Captain Marcus Brennan had become airtight. In his cell, Stripped of his rank insignia and his authority and his uncle's protection, Brennan sat on a thin mattress and stared at the concrete wall. For 4 years, he had believed himself untouchable. He had believed that power flowed from connections, and that his connections reached all the way to the Pentagon. He had believed that the people he hurt were beneath notice, that their suffering was invisible, that no one who mattered would ever care. He had been wrong about all of it, and now the walls were closing in. Specialist Ryan Torres was 300 miles away at Fort Campbell when his phone rang. He had been assigned to a logistics unit there for the past 7 months, processing supply requisitions and trying to forget what had happened to him at Fort Bragg. The ribs had healed. The nightmares had not. He did not recognize the number, but he answered anyway. Specialist Torres, this is Special Agent Morrison with the Criminal Investigation Division. We are calling regarding Captain Marcus Brennan and incidents that occurred during your time in his selection course. Are you willing to speak with us? Torres sat down heavily on his bunk. His hands had started shaking the moment he heard Brennan's name. For 8 months, he had told himself that there was nothing he could do, that complaining would only destroy his career, that the system was designed to protect men like Brennan. He has been arrested. Agent Morrison continued. We have substantial evidence of a pattern of abuse spanning 18 months. Your testimony would help ensure he faces justice for what he did to you and others. Torres closed his eyes. He could still feel the boots connecting with his ribs. He could still hear the laughter from the sergeants who had watched. He could still remember the way Brennan had leaned down afterward and whispered that if Torres ever told anyone what really happened, his career would be over before it started. I will testify, Torres said. His voice cracked on the words. Tell me what you need. The video deposition was recorded 3 hours later in a secure conference room at Fort Campbell. Torres sat in front of camera and described what had happened in clinical detail, the way soldiers are trained to give after-action reports. He described the motivation session where Brennan had singled him out for arriving 2 minutes late to formation. He described being ordered to do burpees until he collapsed. He described the kicks that came after, precise and vicious, aimed at his ribs while he lay in the dirt, gasping for air. Rodriguez was there, Torres said. Mills, too. They were laughing. Patterson was recording it on his phone. Brennan said it was motivation. He said real soldiers needed to learn what pain felt like. The CID agent conducting the interview asked how Torres had explained his injuries. Brennan told me what to say, Torres replied. Training accident. I fell during an obstacle course. The medics knew something was wrong. I could see it in their faces, but they wrote down what I told them. A week later, I got orders transferring me to Fort Campbell. No explanation. Just gone. Over the next 48 hours, 5 more depositions were recorded. Specialist Chun from Alaska, his voice flat and distant over the video link, describing a dislocated shoulder that had come from Brennan twisting his arm during a demonstration. Private Santos from Okinawa, her fractured orbital socket still visible as a slight asymmetry in her face, recounting the punch that had come without warning during a classroom exercise. Sergeant Williams from Stuttgart, whose second-degree burns had not come from any cooking accident, but from Brennan holding his hand over an open flame as punishment for a minor uniform violation. Each story was different in its details. Each story was identical in its pattern. Brennan targeted people without protection. He hurt them in ways that could be explained as accidents. He transferred them before they could compare notes with other victims. And his 3 sergeants enabled every moment of it. At Fort Bragg, Sergeant First Class Davidson sat in a different interview room, providing his own statement. He had been on site for only 3 weeks, but in that time he had witnessed enough to corroborate everything the other victims described. The first week I was there, Chun said Captain Brennan made a recruit run until he vomited, then made him run through his own vomit. When the recruit finally collapsed, Brennan kicked sand in his face and called him garbage. The 3 sergeants thought it was hilarious. The CID investigator taking notes looked up. Did you report this incident? Chun shook his head. Patterson told me on my first day that complaints about Captain Brennan go through channels his uncle controls. He said the last sergeant who raised concerns got transferred to Alaska within 72 hours. I believed him, so I kept my mouth shut. But you tried to warn some of the candidates. Chen nodded slowly. Vali. I mean, Major Vance. I told her to report sick before the hand-to-hand session. I knew something bad was going to happen. I could see the way Brennan looked at her, like she was prey. The investigator made another note. Your cooperation will be reflected in the final report, Sergeant. Is there anything else you can tell us about the command climate in Captain Brennan's unit? Chen was silent for a moment. Then he leaned forward. Everyone knew, he said quietly. Not just the sergeants. The medics who treated the injuries knew those were not accidents. The administrative staff who processed the transfer orders knew something was wrong. The candidates who washed out knew they had been abused. But nobody said anything because nobody believed anything would change. Brennan's uncle was a general. The system protected him. That was just how it was. He sat back until Major Vance showed up and proved that it did not have to be. In a conference room across the base, Major Vance sat with Colonel Hammond reviewing the scope of what their investigation had uncovered. The evidence files were organized in folders that covered the entire table, each one representing a life damaged by Captain Brennan's cruelty. This is bigger than we anticipated, Hammond said. 6 confirmed victims with hospital records. At least 11 more with documented incidents that did not require hospitalization. And those are just the ones we know about. Vance studied the files. How many candidates went through his program in 4 years? Hammond checked her notes. Approximately 240. With a washout rate of 60%, that means roughly 144 candidates who did not complete the course. We have no way of knowing how many of them left because of legitimate failure versus how many were driven out by abuse. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young woman in candidate fatigues stood in the doorway, her posture uncertain. Vance recognized her immediately. Martinez. The young woman stepped into the room. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you. I know you are busy, and I know this is probably not protocol, but I needed to say it. She paused, gathering herself. When you grabbed me on the obstacle course, I thought there was nothing I could do. I thought I just had to take it. You showed me I was wrong. Vance stood and walked over to her. You were never wrong for feeling that way. The system failed you. It failed all of you. She placed a hand on Martinez's shoulder. But you're going to finish this course under new leadership, and when you graduate, you're going to remember that nobody has the right to treat you like that. Nobody. Martinez nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She saluted, turned, and left. Hammond watched her go. The new class commander arrives tomorrow. Full oversight protocols will be in place by the end of the week. Vance returned to her seat. It is not enough. No, Hammond agreed. But it is a start. The Pentagon briefing room was 3,000 miles from Fort Bragg, but the ripples of Operation Clean Sweep had reached it within hours of the first arrest. Secretary of Defense Harold Mitchell sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, flanked by the Joint Chiefs and a cluster of aides who had been summoned on short notice. The clock on the wall showed 0700, and none of them had slept. Colonel Hammond's face appeared on the secure video link, her image crisp against the gray walls of the JSOC Command Center. The evidence is conclusive, Mr. Secretary, she said. 47 documented incidents of abuse over 18 months. 11 hospitalizations with injuries inconsistent with training accidents. 23 sworn statements from victims and witnesses. Captain Brennan operated with impunity because he believed his family connections made him untouchable. Secretary Mitchell studied the summary document in front of him. His expression revealed nothing, but his voice carried an edge that made the officers around him shift uncomfortably. This happened on our watch, he said. Every one of those injuries, every one of those careers damaged, every candidate who was driven out of service by this man. It happened because we had systems that were supposed to prevent it, and those systems failed. He turned to the Army Chief of Staff. General, I want an immediate review of oversight protocols at every Special Operations Selection course across all branches. Independent medical review for any training injury. Anonymous reporting channels that do not route through unit commanders. And I want it implemented within 30 days. The general nodded. Yes, Mr. Secretary. Mitchell returned his attention to the video link. Colonel Hammond, You have my full support to pursue this investigation wherever it leads. No rank, no connection, no family name will provide protection. Is that understood? Understood, sir. At Fort Bragg, the three sergeants sat in separate interview rooms, each facing identical choices. Rodriguez went first. Captain Williams from JAG laid out the evidence with clinical precision. Video of you participating in the assault of recruit Martinez. Audio of you conspiring with Captain Brennan to target recruit Vale. Witness statements placing you at 11 separate incidents over the past 14 months. She slid a document across the table. You are facing 12 to 18 years at Leavenworth if this goes to trial. Rodriguez stared at the paper without reading it. What are you offering? Full cooperation. Testimony against Captain Brennan detailing everything you witnessed during your time under his command. Williams leaned back. In exchange, the conspiracy charges get reduced. You're looking at 3 to 5 years instead of 12 to 18. Rodriguez was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up the pen. Mills took the same deal an hour later. Patterson had already been cooperating since the moment of arrest, and his early assistance earned him the most favorable terms of all. 18 months with the possibility of parole in exchange for testimony that would help bury Captain Brennan. By the end of the day, all three sergeants had signed agreements that transformed them from co-defendants into prosecution witnesses. Brennan learned of their betrayal from his JAG-appointed defense attorney, a young captain named Stevens who had drawn the short straw of representing the most hated man at Fort Bragg. They flipped, Stevens said. All three of them. Rodriguez, Mills, Patterson. They're going to testify against you in exchange for reduced sentences. Brennan sat motionless in his cell. The orange jumpsuit he now wore had replaced his uniform, and the transformation seemed to have aged him 10 years overnight. They are cowards, he said finally. They will say whatever JAG wants them to say. Stevens opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. Captain Brennan, I need you to understand the situation. He spread documents across the small table. Video evidence of 47 incidents. Audio recordings of you threatening candidates and conspiring with your sergeants. Medical records showing patterns of injury inconsistent with training. Sworn statements from 23 witnesses, including 6 victims who were hospitalized. He paused. And now testimony from your own subordinates. Brennan's jaw tightened. What are they offering? Stevens consulted his notes. Guilty plea to reduced charges. 10 to 15 years instead of 20 to 25. Possibility of parole after 8 years with good behavior. Brennan shook his head. I was making soldiers. Everything I did was to prepare them for combat. The people I washed out could not handle the pressure. They would have gotten other soldiers killed. Stevens closed the folder. Captain, with respect, that defense will not work. The evidence shows a clear pattern of abuse targeting candidates without family connections, candidates who could be hurt without consequences. This was not about training. This was about power. Brennan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. I am not pleading guilty to anything. Those people at JSOC do not understand what it takes to create warriors. That woman, that Delta operator, she went through the same kind of training I provided. The only difference is that nobody recorded it. Stevens gathered his documents. I will inform JAG that you are refusing the plea offer. Court-martial proceedings will begin within 60 days. He stood and signaled the guard. Captain Brennan, I strongly advise you to reconsider. The cell door closed behind him. At JSOC headquarters, Colonel Hammond conducted a press briefing that would be broadcast to military installations worldwide. She stood at a podium bearing the Joint Special Operations insignia, her uniform immaculate, her voice steady. Today, she announced, the Department of Defense is implementing comprehensive reforms to oversight protocols at all Special Operations selection courses. Effective immediately, any training injury requiring medical attention will be reviewed by an independent medical board. Anonymous reporting channels will be established at every installation, with complaints routed directly to the Inspector General rather than through unit commanders. She paused and looked directly into the camera. The conduct of Captain Marcus Brennan and his subordinates represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in military leadership. They used their authority to harm the people they were supposed to train. They exploited a system designed to protect them while victimizing those without connections or recourse. That ends today. Questions erupted from the assembled reporters, but Hammond held up her hand. Court-martial proceedings against Captain Brennan will commence in 60 days. He faces multiple charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, and conspiracy. If convicted on all counts, he is looking at 15 to 25 years at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. She gathered her notes. No further questions at this time. Major Elena Vance watched the briefing from a secure room at Fort Bragg. 6 weeks of her life had been devoted to building this case. 6 weeks of pretending to be weak, pretending to be afraid, pretending to be exactly the kind of victim Brennan loved to break. Now the institution was responding. Policies were changing. Victims were being heard. But the work was not finished. There would be depositions, testimony, courtroom appearances. There would be appeals and procedural challenges and defense attorneys trying to find any crack in the evidence. Vance was ready for all of it. She had taken down terrorist networks in 4 countries. She had eliminated targets that entire task forces had failed to reach. And now she had dismantled a predator who had hidden behind rank and family connections for 4 years. Captain Marcus Brennan had chosen her because he thought she was powerless. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. 6 months later, the parade ground at Fort Bragg gleamed under a November sun that carried just enough warmth to remind everyone that winter had not yet arrived. Rows of folding chairs faced a wooden platform draped in red, white, and blue bunting. Senior officers filled the front rows while enlisted personnel and civilian guests occupied the seats behind them. Major Elena Vance stood at attention near the platform, wearing her dress uniform for the first time since the operation began. The bruise on her cheek had faded months ago, but she could still feel the ghost of Brennan's strike if she thought about it long enough. She chose not to think about it. The honor guard marched into position with ceremonial precision, their rifles gleaming, their movements synchronized to the beat of an unseen drum. Specialist Ryan Torres stood among them, his posture perfect, his face composed. The ribs that Brennan had broken 8 months ago had healed completely. The nightmares came less frequently now, though they had not stopped entirely. He caught Vance's eye as the honor guard took their positions. A small nod passed between them. No words were necessary. Colonel Patricia Hammond approached the podium as the ceremony began. She wore her dress uniform as well, the silver eagles on her shoulders catching the light as she surveyed the assembled crowd. 6 months ago, she said, her voice carrying across the parade ground without amplification, this installation witnessed something that should never happen in the United States military. A commanding officer used his position to abuse, intimidate, and assault the soldiers entrusted to his care. He was protected by family connections and enabled by subordinates who chose complicity over courage. She paused, letting the words settle. Today, we are here to recognize the officer who ended that abuse and to recommit ourselves to the principles that make our military worthy of the sacrifices it demands. Hammond turned and gestured toward the platform. Major Elena Vance, please come forward. Vance climbed the 3 wooden steps and crossed to where Hammond waited. The citation was read aloud by a staff officer, detailing the parameters of Operation Clean Sweep without revealing classified specifics. 6 weeks undercover. Documentation of systematic abuse. The takedown that had been seen by an entire training class and retold across every military installation in the country. For extraordinary courage, exceptional judgment, and unwavering commitment to the welfare of her fellow soldiers, Hammond said, placing the medal around Vance's neck. The Department of Defense awards Major Elena Vance the Defense Superior Service Medal. Applause rippled across the parade ground. Vance stood at attention, her expression neutral, though something warm moved through her chest. When the applause faded, Hammond continued, I want to share some numbers with you today. Since Operation Clean Sweep concluded, the Department of Defense has implemented 23 policy changes across all Special Operations selection courses. Independent medical review is now mandatory for any training injury. Anonymous reporting channels have been established at every installation, with complaints routed directly to the Inspector General. Oversight committees have been formed at every major command. She looked out at the crowd. These changes exist because people had the courage to come forward. Because victims who had been scattered across 4 continents agreed to testify about what was done to them. Because witnesses who had been told to stay silent chose to speak. She paused. And because one officer was willing to spend 6 weeks pretending to be powerless so that she could document the truth. The ceremony continued with remarks from the base commander and a representative from the Secretary of Defense's office. Each speaker emphasized the same themes: accountability, reform, the promise that what happened under Brennan's command would never be allowed to happen again. When the formal program concluded, the crowd dispersed across the parade ground. Vance found herself surrounded by well-wishers, officers, and enlisted personnel who wanted to shake her hand or simply say thank you. Martinez appeared at the edge of the crowd, now wearing the insignia of a newly graduated soldier. She had completed the selection course under new leadership and earned her place in a support unit attached to Special Operations Command. When Vance caught her eye, Martinez snapped a salute that was slightly too sharp, slightly too earnest, exactly right. Vance returned it. Torres approached after the crowd had thinned. He was still in his honor guard uniform, his bearing military perfect, but his eyes held something vulnerable. "I never thought I would come back here," he said quietly. "After what happened, I thought this place would always mean pain. And now?" Torres looked around the parade ground, at the new class of candidates assembling near the training facilities, at the oversight personnel who now observed every exercise. "Now it means something else," he said. "It means the system can change. It means the people who hurt us face consequences." He met her eyes. "It means you believed us when no one else would." Vance placed a hand on his shoulder. "You believed yourselves. I just made sure someone was listening." She walked toward the training facilities where the new selection course commander, a lieutenant colonel with 20 years of spotless service, was addressing the assembled candidates. His voice carried across the yard, firm but without cruelty. "This course will be the hardest thing you have ever done," he said. "You will be pushed beyond what you think you can endure. You will fail, and you will get back up, and you will fail again. That is how warriors are made." His gaze swept across the rows of nervous faces. "But you will never be abused. You will never be targeted for who you are or who you know. You will be treated with the dignity that every soldier deserves. If anyone violates that trust, there are systems in place to hold them accountable. Use them." Behind him, 2 oversight officers stood with clipboards, observing the proceedings. They would be present for every training session, every evaluation, every moment when power could be misused. The days of unchecked authority were over. Vance watched the candidates file toward their barracks, remembering her own arrival 6 months ago. She had stepped off that bus pretending to be afraid, pretending to be weak, pretending to be exactly what Brennan wanted to destroy. Now Brennan was in a cell at Fort Leavenworth, 18 years into a sentence that would end his military career and consume the prime of his life. His uncle had retired in disgrace. His 3 sergeants were serving their own sentences at military correctional facilities across the country. The network of protection that had allowed him to operate with impunity had been dismantled piece by piece. And here, at the place where it had all happened, a new class was beginning under the watchful eyes of people who would never let it happen again. So let me ask you something as we close out this story. Have you ever seen someone finally face real consequences for abusing their power? Have you ever watched a system that protected the wrong people finally turn around and protect the right ones? If you have, you know what that moment feels like. If you have not, maybe this story showed you that it is possible. Major Elena Vance turned away from the training grounds and walked toward the parking lot where her vehicle waited. There would be other missions, other operations, other moments when someone needed to stand between the powerful and the powerless. She would be ready. Behind her, The sun continued its arc across the Carolina sky, and a new generation of soldiers began the journey that would define them. They would be tested. They would be challenged. They would be pushed to their limits and beyond. But they would not be broken. Not like this. Not ever again.